Hello, mentors. Welcome to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I am very excited about the wide range of experts who have volunteered to give up their time and expertise. They will share their innovative ideas, their exciting perspectives, their rich resources, and their research with us. Please continue to delve into these topics on their websites and with your legal counsel, healthcare provider, and education professional. Our guests will have information that will be relevant to mentors supporting struggling students, parents, teachers, administrators, legal support, and health professionals. We will address all levels of education with issues that affect academic performance. Our goal is to open discussions and introduce a variety of approaches to those searching for information in a free venue. So mentors, let me introduce our guest for today. Hello mentors, this is Judi Epstein, your host from Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. Welcome to our Mentorship in Education podcast series. We've been introducing and discussing several approaches to learning and learning styles, and I have tried to incorporate some of the associated issues with those learning styles as we've spoken to different guests. And our goal is to create a library that's free so that people who are working with struggling students can find a resource to help direct them to some information and answer some of the questions that they have. A unique perspective today is going to be shared by our guest. I'm going to introduce Woody Clift. Hello, Woody.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Woody and I have had some challenges to get this off the ground, and I want to thank him for his patience in following through and being here today. Before I get into a discussion with Woody, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit about his background. Woody is the director of the DYS Education Initiative at the Collaborative for Educational Services in Massachusetts. His main role is to create and sustain high-quality educational experiences for youth in the juvenile justice system. He's had over 20 years' experience in working with stakeholders, people who are involved in this process across all of the disciplines to improve the social, emotional, and educational life outcomes for this population. He's worked in schools to develop early intervention programs and help to implement them, as well as train mentors which include teachers and administrators. And I imagine at some point parents are involved in that, or guardians would be involved in that. I'll have to ask you about that more later. He's a licensed superintendent. He's a licensed principal in Massachusetts. He has a PhD in education policy, as well as leadership and administration. And, drum roll please, he is a national champion at Ultimate Frisbee at the Grand Masters level. I love that.
How about that? Yes.
So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that as we begin to talk. But you have a rather interesting background, and I can see where it would connect with what you have chosen to do. Perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit, Woody, about your background and how that led you into working with such a challenging population.
Sure thing, Judy. Thank you, first of all, for that interview. And also, I appreciate your patience and persistence in our technical challenges along the way. So a little bit about my background. I was raised in Washington, D.C., and my family moved there from Decatur, Georgia. So if you hear a little southern drawl, that's where that comes from. It's hard to shake. And moved to Washington, D.C., and I went to the D.C. public schools during the crack epidemic of the nation, when Washington, D.C. was known as the murder capital of the nation.
Oh my gosh.
And it was not uncommon for me mostly in high school to see young people really struggling with the societal factors that were impacting their lives: poverty, oppression, racism, institutional and otherwise, and drugs, and saw guns in our schools. And you really had to, fight for your education.
Oh my
It
gosh.
had to be a priority for you. And, I had more means, if you will. My mom was a budding journalist at the time, and I received a fair amount of support. And when I went to school, I was one of those kids who I would just say was focused on learning. I was perhaps I wasn't dealing with, can I eat when I get home today?
Right.
What will I find when I get home today? And so the DC public schools were quite a challenging environment. And while I was there, I saw a fair amount of inequities in terms of, who got their education, who was attended to, and I had a really, it was a challenging experience. But what I learned at that time was that a teacher can make a huge difference in your life. And a teacher, my social studies teacher, told me about an essay contest where it was about apartheid and how apartheid might end. And I entered. I had no thoughts that I was going to win this essay contest, but I did. And it was quite it was a DC wide essay contest, and I won this trip to West Africa as the grand prize.
Wow.
I was a little 15-year-old boy, I'd like to say, at that time, and I was traveling by myself to West Africa. And that trip, side by side with what that teacher did for me to help me believe in myself, was, I would say, the beginning of my mission to work at the intersection between social justice and education.
That's amazing. I can't even imagine about how a 15-year-old would feel on his or her way to Africa. I mean, talk about culture shock.
That's right.
And language barriers, and that would be pretty amazing. Did you go on to do any more writing? I'm curious.
I love to write. I haven't found that as a passion in the same way that my mom does. She pursues, she's a journalist, and she helped bring out my best writing skills as a young writer, budding writer in high school, with the red ink and the correct. But it was all done with care and compassion, so it did bring out the best in my writing skills.
So it didn't damage your ego all that much.
No, actually, I think it helped.
That's good.
Yeah.
Woody, I want to talk to you a little bit about the population of students that you work with, in terms of how you remediate or attempt to remediate some of the behavior that you see. And one of the things that I struggled with as a teacher working with a very similar population in a different capacity was the difference between discipline and consequences, and the battle, that we sometimes want to engage ourselves in as a teacher in the classroom about, the power struggle, the constant power struggle. So can you kind of address your philosophy on that and how you apply it to some of the things that you do with these kids?
Absolutely. So I think if there's a word to describe me, I would say alternative is the word that is a through line throughout in my life. I have found that somehow, some way, the notion of discipline became substituted for learning when a young person makes a mistake. And
boy, that's sad.
Yeah, and this notion of discipline and punishment as a way of teaching alternative behaviors is deeply flawed, and yet schools have been constructed around, in many ways, this idea of you break a rule, you get sent to the principal's office, you get suspended, and if you do it again, then another suspension and expulsion, and the negative deleterious consequences of that type of pattern result in maybe the school feeling like they've rid themselves of a problem, but the young person never learning how to change their behavior or understand the consequences of their behavior on their community, on their peers, on themselves. And so I really approach my work and the work that we've done both throughout my professional career and in my work with Department of Youth Services with this notion that every moment is a learning opportunity, and that the challenge is on us to help the young people understand that opportunity so that they can make better choices for themselves and for their future. So that's the seed, or that's the guiding light that I follow in the design of our work throughout the state of Massachusetts. And I will say that one of the luxuries we have in our work, and I think is also a kind of boundary or restriction that we place on ourselves in public schools, is that we don't have enough time. We don't have time to do to teach appropriate behavior, respect, relationships, and rapport. It's all about learning specific content, skill, or knowledge, and we lost that importance of social emotional development in our educational system. And if we can start to give ourselves the time, the permission of the time to learn, I think that both schools, young people, communities will thrive in a much more productive way. The type of violence that we are seeing in today's society, I think, is premised on this notion of not premised, but rage and anger, and not the type of coping skills and community fabric that we try and establish in our schools, and we should strive to do more of.
The last time I spoke with you, just to quote you, you said that one of your roles was to create conditions for success for these struggling youth. Right. And you shared a little bit with me about a story of a girl that you built a relationship with. Maybe I can segue into that, because I think that's a great story, and it's it's an exemplar of that, creating a condition for success.
Sure, I'd be glad to bring her into this conversation, and I appreciate that segue. So this is a young lady who, when I was working in the Oakland Public Schools, an alternative program out there, who really struggled in the typical classroom. She had deep traumatic wounds from her past, and was extremely angry and rageful, and would act out in class, sometimes just fall on the ground and start tantruming, kicking on the floor. And she used really quite derogatory terms towards her peers, racial terms that would tend to provoke others in the classroom.
Can you give us an age range where?
Absolutely. So this is elementary school. So she was I think she was 10 years old.
Okay.
And the peers, it was a mixed grouping class. So there were some peers who were a little bit older and some who were a little bit younger.
Okay.
And she would just drop different F-bombs and various curse words in the middle of class. And it was really to try and her intention, I think, was to create distraction and attention and in really negative ways. So over time, my job was to really develop a relationship with her and to help her come up with new ways of dealing with or getting what she wanted in a more productive manner. So we had been working on this for several months during the beginning of the school year, and she just was not changing her behavior in a way that I wasn't seeing the positive changes, and maybe limited small changes, but not enough to get her through a full class period. So one day I decided that we had had enough. I had had enough, and it was in the sense that I needed to try something new. And she fell on the floor. She was kicking and screaming and curse words flying out of her mouth. And somehow, I don't really remember how this happened, but somehow I was able to convince her to come with me out of the classroom down to this room. It's kind of a calming room for young people who were having serious challenges. So
I'm going to stop you 1 second. Yeah. That's an interesting concept, a calming room. I want to come back to that later. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to that. And so she and I spent a little time down in the room together, and she was yelling and screaming and cursing at me and cursing at everybody. And occasionally I'd try and interrupt the cursing, and she was still having at it. So I just committed the time to having her go through this period where she was acting out and raging, where she would settle down, hit that kind of calming period, and be able to then think again, to be able to then engage again. And this is just the psychology of that type of emotion. You can't think straight when you're in the midst of it.
Right.
So I had a little time with her, and and as I said to you in our last conversation, I'm a little ashamed of what follows, in the sense that it's not a perfect intervention. I don't think I would do it again the same way. But I needed to give her something to occupy herself as she was calming down. And I asked her to do, I asked her to write lines. And these are not an go-to intervention anymore, but it was, I will not cuss, I will not cuss, I will not cuss. And she wrote, front and back. So she did it. She wrote it, and she handed it to me, and she had a little bit of a smile on her face, and she was proud, and I was proud of her, actually. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't going to settle we hadn't made the breakthrough yet. And she handed it to me, and I said, well, this doesn't have a name on it. How am I going to know who did this? And she looks at me quizzically, and she grabs the paper back, and she writes her first name and hands it back. And I said, well, there's another person with this name in the class or in the school. So how there's got to be a last name. So she hands it back to me, and the last name is a chosen 4-letter word. And I just started, I had a smile on my face, and she had a smile on her face. And I said, okay, now going forward, that's the word, and those are the words that we cannot use in class. And here are some words. And we had a little bit of a moment where we talked about other words that she can use. I love that. Continued. And from that point forward, honestly, I cannot recall a time in which she started using those words, derogatory words towards her peers, or in an explosion. She was using funny words, fudge.
Right.
I mean, she was still, some of the tantruming was there, but it started to de-escalate over time. And really the kernel of that story, Judi, is that I had a relationship with her.
Yes, that's the most important part.
And because of that, and the trust that she and I had developed, and the fact that I cared about her, but I wasn't going to coddle her, which I think is a really important distinction, sometimes lost in the eyes of teachers who come into the profession who care deeply. But I cared about her, but I had high expectations for her. I expected that she would rise to meet those expectations. And she did. She did. And in fact, those of you on the radio can't see this, but on the board behind us are her lines that say, I will not cuss, I will not cuss, I will not cuss, because she changed my life as well.
You say that it might not have been the best approach, that you're not sure you would use it again. Yeah. Maybe you would or wouldn't use it again, but she obviously felt something much more important in that process. And it wasn't just her writing and your expectation of her to write, but it was your expectation of her in the sense that she could do better and your willingness to give her the time and the opportunity to do better. That's the way I see it. And, you know, we're fallible too. We try things, and I used to tell my students that, you know, I'm not perfect. I'm going to try something, and if it doesn't work, I'll try it again. And if they want to give me some feedback, I'm willing to listen to that. I just want to share one little story with you in that vein. I used to work with this population of students also, kids that were remanded by the courts that were in alternative schools. And one of my high school students, I believe he's about 15, used to use the same language in class. It wasn't always when he was angry. Sometimes it was when he was responding to a request. He would say F no, or if his pencil fell, it was F this or that, or whatever word he wanted. And so it's funny that we did something very similar. I had him come into my room one day, and I said to him, you know, there are other F words. Let's look them up in the dictionary. And he made a list of some of them, and we narrowed it down to 1 or 2 or 3, I don't remember, of F words that he could use in different situations. And he was in the hall one day, and the director of the school asked him to do something. And he turned around to her and he said, I don't really think that's feasible. And he walked away instead of saying, you know, F no. And she came into me and she said, she told me what he did. And she said, you're the only one that would do that. She said, I was just, my jaw dropped open. She said, I couldn't believe he did that. But, you know, it's so important to take the time to model some of the skills that these kids need, because they have not had the opportunity to see anyone do anything differently than the way they're doing it. And you did that, and I think that she probably still remembers today. If you were to talk to her that special time with you. Cliff, you mentioned to me again when we were speaking that some of the alternative approaches, like the one you just described, that you use with the kids, you use the words positive intervention and supports, and you also talked about responsive classrooms. And maybe you can share a little bit about those with our mentors who are listening, who might be, particularly teachers, who might be looking for other ways to implement behavior change in their classroom.
Absolutely. So, but before I do, I just wanted to build on your last story. First of all, fantastic that you developed that command of a new word. But what's underlying that is also a sense of agency that you offered him that he may not have held before. And, those words were probably words that gave him a sense of power, and maybe a little bit superficially. But then when you transition, he can still have that sense of agency with a new word or a new phrase or new behavior. I think that is at the root of success with all young people. It's about developing their sense of agency and identity. And when you feel you can do something and you can make that thing happen and it has a positive effect, then you start to learn new ways of being and doing. So I just wanted to pick that up and
I appreciate that. Thank you. Before we move into what I asked you, can you explain a little bit what you mean by agency?
Sure, I'd love to. What we want is not command and control in the classroom as a teacher that comes from the top down, but rather you want to create a learning community where the students in your class feel that they have some ownership of the behaviors and norms of that community and their role in that community and their future in terms of their academic development. So agency is about how I feel as an individual, and that I believe I can act on and make choices that will serve my better interests.
Is it related to self-efficacy?
Yeah, it's very, very closely related to self-efficacy.
All right.
And for me, it's just this, and as you get towards adolescence, it becomes even more important to recognize that the dilemma of an adolescent is to become more agentic. And so how does a teacher establish a classroom where young people see relevance in what they're doing, that it's authentic to who they are, they see themselves in the curriculum, and then they can act on that knowledge in their own learning and development. The teacher is more of the facilitator. It's very Deweyan of learning, as opposed to facts and figures as the core of learning. Now, we still are in that place where testing, state tests and mandates demand that kids learn a bunch of knowledge and discrete knowledge, and are less focused on the analytical thinking and persuasive writing that I think is what will make you a successful lifelong learner in society. But I went off script a little bit there.
No. I appreciate that, but because of what you just said, I'm going to throw in something before you get into my question about positive intervention and supports. You gave me a quote when we were talking a while ago about underlying assumption that control of a classroom is imposed. Mm-hmm. That you did say identity and agency and how they relate. So can you talk about the positive intervention and supports and responsive classrooms in conjunction with this sense that as teachers, we often feel that we need to be in control of everything, that there's that power thing going on?
So responsive classroom is an approach that I haven't invented myself. It's something that has been promoted as a research-based approach, and I think it's even a curriculum that's used in schools across the country. And the approach is focused initially on what are our norms and our community expectations that we're going to hold ourselves to, and who are my classmates and who are my who am I within this community. And so you really spend the initial part of the first month of school and then ongoing throughout the schooling period or academic year, establishing those norms and routines and getting to know one another, and then having certain routines like a morning circle whereby you continue to tighten that thread that brings that fabric together in the community. And so the core of that really is how do we create a learning community, and we create some binds that connects us within that learning community. And then positive behavior supports another national research-based approach that many school districts have adopted, is an approach that is both individual focused and a system-wide approach. So the whole school embraces an approach for focusing on catching kids doing things right.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the more you catch somebody doing something right, if you find a way to acknowledge that and celebrate that in connection to the type of community you've talked about establishing. So for instance, you want to have a community where we treat each other with kindness and compassion. If you catch somebody doing something within that, you find a way to celebrate that and lift that up. And in so doing, young people begin to cultivate the identity that is a positive identity, a sense of caring and compassion. So you're lifting up those values and rewarding it so that it begins to cement within the culture. And so that's how all of these things tie together. What we want to do is, and I strongly believe, that everybody has a yearning to be connected, to feel a part of something. And that could be something that could be mischievous. That could be something that could be part of a team or a community. And to the degree you can keep people in schools or in your classroom feeling like they're part of a community, something special, and they're connected, they're seen, they're heard, and that you're going to do everything you can to help bring out the best in them, you will have the type of, and I use this in a positive sense, control over your classroom that you imagine, or some of us may imagine, is established through rules and consequences. So to the degree you can make it intrinsic versus extrinsic, you will, the grease that makes learning happen comes from that intrinsic motivation and connectedness that you're trying to establish as a teacher.
Do you think that students sometimes misbehave or have aberrant behavior in the classroom to get attention? And if we recognize kids for positive responses and they get that same attention when they do something right as when they do something troublesome, that the troublesome behavior becomes less important to them?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the, if you can help a young person, there was a young man that I worked with, again, I'm going to go back to my days in Oakland, and the young man, he used to act out so that a certain adult who was responsible for the alternative classroom, like the in-house suspension room, he would get in trouble so that he could go spend time with that adult. And so once we were able to help him and see that this was what he was doing, and we all saw it, we just figured okay, how can we structure this into your day so that you can spend time with this man who you deeply respect and you care about, and you don't have to get in trouble to go do it.
Right.
Now, what that also meant is that the teacher in the classroom had to be willing to let that student out in order to also have, over time, that student spend more time in the class. So you're at this point where the young person's blowing out of class 3 times a week. So let's just structure it 3 times a week. You're going to go to class, go spend time with this guy.
Wow.
And then over time, we'll structure it so that you spend more time in class. Now, that's not always a luxury that all public schools have in terms of resources, but this was a small alternative school, and the type of therapeutic interventions that we were able to put into place, this would be one of them. I mean, it's supposed to get attention. Sometimes it's to get out of something, right? So, and you maybe have that similar experience, but unfortunately I hear too often young people say, I'm not good at math. There's kind of a math mindset that seems to have been accepted in our culture, that you can say, I'm not good at math. You don't often hear young people say, I'm not a good reader. It may be true, but they don't declare it so openly. And so I have seen, and if you look at some, there's ways to study this, like behavior analysis, but if you see that every time, maybe 15 minutes before math class starts, that somebody has some difficulty or an argument, then you can maybe put 2 and 2 together and say, okay, this young man or woman wants to get out of math class. So how then can we address, whatever it is about math class, the phobia, the stigma that goes with it, the lack of self-efficacy or agency that we talked about earlier? How do you help shift that? And I think that's the craft of being a really effective teacher, is knowing your young people, knowing what motivates them and what scares them, and helping to provision for those realities within your day-to-day lessons. Now, in Department of Youth Services, in our classes, this is not always easy. You have very small classes, and in the treatment settings, when a young person is committed to the department, you do have more time to get to know that young person and to account for a relationship building. But in some ways, in our detention settings, young people can be there for a day and up to 2 years, depending upon the nature of the offense that they're being processed. So a teacher doesn't have the time to try and build a relationship, something that you and I would think of that is established through small trust building opportunities over time. So really what that teacher has to do is demonstrate in every moment that they care about the young person before them, regardless of where they are in their anger at the system or what have you. And that caring serves as a buffer for that young person to start paying attention to what's being offered to them in the classroom. And trust is not something that teachers should assume is easily established. And in our settings in particular, trust is always usually challenged, in the sense that there's such a background of trauma and mistrust that is rooted in the young person's life and spirit. So they're going to test you. They've also learned very challenging behaviors to kind of avoid some of that mistrust and what comes with that, and the trauma that could come with being vulnerable. So I often say that the very small acts that you can do over time will serve to create that trust. And that can be as simple as, how was your night last night? Or upholding the expectations in the classroom so that people feel safe.
Oh, that's so important.
Yep. Showing up at work every day, and bringing your best self to that work, and asking questions that show that you care. That's how you develop the trust. And I'll add one more thing, Judi, which I think we talked about once before, which is one of the mistakes that I've seen in public schools and in our department with our workforce, and is that sometimes people personalize the behaviors of young people. And it's understandable. Teachers are there because they're passionate about and care about kids. And so when they're challenged or confronted or otherwise, it's easy to take it personal. And that takes you nowhere positive. When you are engaged in a moment where a young person is challenging you and you take it personally, it becomes a power struggle very quickly. And you need to do the best you can to separate the young person's behaviors from the young person and how they feel about you deeply. And don't personalize it. Be prepared with certain proposed solutions. Give yourself some time through that moment, but don't personalize it.
They could be mad at their mother. They could be mad at women in general because they were betrayed. If it's a man in the classroom, they could have been beaten by a man that morning. So, and this is the place where they get to speak up. They couldn't do it before. So it might not have anything to do with you as an individual.
And in fact, you're absolutely right. That notion of this is a space where they can now speak up.
Right.
Actually is a reflection, if possible, of you as a teacher and the type of community you have established. I know it's counterintuitive, but it's true.
But it's true, very true.
Right. And then you have to kind of funnel that type of sense of safety towards a more productive means. It may be a section of the room that you've established for calming. And I've seen fantastic teachers do this where, they've set aside a part of the room where there's a lot of kind of hands-on stuff that a young person can sit down, they can calm down, they need to take a quick break, and then they can come back to class. And some schools actually have rooms that are, as we talked about earlier, a place where a student can calm down, talk to somebody they trust and care about, and then return to the classroom. And I think that these strategies, though sometimes feel threatening to the teacher in the sense that you're giving over control, you're letting a student miss a section of learning or go do something, and that you have to just continue the class. The return on that investment and taking that risk is really quite profound.
I just want to share two things quickly because we're not here to talk about me, but I just wanted to share two things you touched on. I did teach in a DYS facility for a brief period of time, and one of the best things that happened to me while I was teaching there was when I came into the classroom and one of my old students was there. And when you talk about developing trust, I didn't have to develop trust with the whole class because he got up and told them that, about me. And so I had that trust, and there were guards in the classroom. And when I left, this student, 2 other students, and 2 of the guards wrote me recommendations because they said I deserved to get a job somewhere else. Thought that was really sweet. And then I just wanted to mention to you that I used to run, you mentioned in-house suspension rooms. I used to run in-house suspension rooms, both in the school and also in the local police station. And the teachers would come in to bring work in to one of the students that got kicked out. And all my kids would always be working or doing something, working in groups or working together. And the teachers would say to me, I can't have one of them in the classroom. How do you have 10 in the classroom? And it's all about trust and respect. That's what it's about. It's about trust and respect. When I used to do workshops with teachers, I used to tell them all those lists of rules you have on the board, all those, things that could, raise your hand and don't speak over somebody, and everything was, delineated. There'd be 15 rules on the wall or whatever. I said, all you need is two signs in your room, trust and respect. And you say to the kids, I'm going to work hard to earn your trust. I hope you'll work hard to earn mine. Mm-hmm. And I want to earn your respect. Mm-hmm. And so I will do whatever you think I need to do to earn your respect, and I hope you will earn my respect. And those are the only 2 rules we had in the room. So when someone would start talking, when I was talking and I would look at them, one of the other kids would say to them, because I had said it so many times, is that respectful? Is that respectful? Are you showing her respect? Mm-hmm. And it's a good feeling. It takes time. But it's, as you say, it's just as important as the academics. Just as important as the academics.
Yeah, I appreciate those stories. Those are great.
I know that you do workshops with teachers, and one of the things you listed as developing with the teachers is the idea of personalizing the behavior, making them aware of not personalizing the behavior. You kind of touched on a couple of others, but maybe I know there are 5 others, big mistakes that you feel that teachers make. And these 6 form a basis for the workshops you do with the teachers. Can you talk a little bit about those in particular? Because I would like our mentors who are listening, and I think parents would benefit from this also, not personalizing the blow up of someone, one of their kids, because something could have happened at school, and home is the safe place for them to explode too. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can share some of these in a little more detail, please.
I'll do my best. Well,
okay.
So we've talked a little bit about not personalizing
yes.
Behaviors in the classroom, and if you end up personalizing the behaviors, you will find yourself in a power struggle. And so to the degree we can help teachers both learn how to extricate themselves from a power struggle when they find themselves in it, because it's inevitable that you will get triggered at some point as a teacher. And how do you find your way out of that? When I was in Oakland, one of the things we had a code word that we used among teacher and paraprofessional that was you have a phone call. It was a phrase, and so that sense was a way in which we, as the adults, the caring adults in the room, recognize, as you point out earlier, that we're all fallible, to intervene in that moment when somebody has gotten under our skin and it's not bringing out our best selves as the adults. So one, it's having some tools in your toolbox to know when you are engaged in that power conflict. It may also just be self-awareness. So what are the feelings I have in my body when I'm engaged in this, when I'm caught in a power struggle? And how do I recognize those and change the script in that moment from whatever I'm engaged in, locking horns with a student, to something that's more productive. And so that's important.
So the first thing you're saying that teachers need to be aware of, and parents and anyone who works with kids needs to be aware of what the dynamics are of the relationship that they're having with the student. And if they're aware that it's becoming a power issue, that needs to be redirected into something more productive.
That's right. You try and diffuse the power over situation and try and find a way to be power with the student, as opposed to I'm in control right now. Because what that often leads to, and this is another one of my framework principles, is it results in this old mental model of, okay, I'm going to discipline you. I'm going to kick you out of class, or I'm going to send you into the hallway and go see the principal. And the negative effect of kicking someone out of class or sending them to the vice principal's office or principal's office in a typical public school is that you give up your agency as a teacher with that student, and you compromise your trust and rapport that you may have worked so hard to establish. So in essence, you're saying, I can't deal with you. I can't reinforce the norms in this class. I can't hold everybody accountable right now through our fabric in our community. I'm giving up on it and I'm sending you away. Right. And so the lesson there for the young person is, all that work that we've been working on, it's really, there's a point at which it goes out the window, and so the teacher loses some control in when they make that choice of disciplining and sending somebody out of the room. Now, don't get me wrong. If there's violence towards others being perpetrated or aggression, you do have to maintain the safety and community norms of others in your classroom. And that also might mean that the rest of you stand up and leave the class and call someone else in. But those should be very few and far between as far as that type of intervention. To the degree a teacher can, in those moments, hold the class accountable. And you brought it up with a young person who actually said, now, is that being respectful? So over time, you had established a classroom culture and norm of being respectful to one another, about identifying when somebody might not be being respectful, and then recasting the moment into a learning moment for the whole class. And over and over and over again, that just becomes the heartbeat of your classroom. So in the same way, when a young person, we actually had a similar situation recently. A young person was new to a program. We get new students whenever a judge sends them to us. And the teacher I was talking to said that the student was challenging the computer norms in the classroom, so appropriate use of the computers. And the other students said, we don't do that in here. Mr. B will be good to you. I forget how it was, but it was like, Mr. B's got your back. Just knock off what you're doing. It was kind of just a sense of, you don't have to challenge him. He's on your side. They trust, we trust you. And so that teacher had ownership, had authority, had the relationships in that classroom. And even a young person who was brand spanking new, who was trying to figure out where are the guardrails, the other young people held him to them.
That's the best support you can have, is when it comes from the classroom rather than from things that, that you're telling the student. There are 6 things here, and
Yep.
I know you have said, we've talked about personalizing behavior. You've touched a little bit, or quite a bit, on developing a relationship.
Yep.
You touched on the consequences of kicking students out of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So there are 3 left, and I want you to kind of go through those before we run out of time.
Absolutely.
One is the time as the driving force in the classroom, and you mentioned the terms of being the compass of the moment. And perhaps you can talk a little bit that, and then talk about what you mean by implicit bias and this concept of passion.
So with the pressures on teachers to cover scope and sequence of
Mm-hmm.
content in their classroom, there's this intensity of, I got to cover this. Everyone's got to know it. I got, that's going to be on the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System test. And if I don't cover it, the students aren't going to be successful on this high stakes test. And it just becomes this domino effect of, yes.
No, I was just going to say, I just had a thought that I think sometimes teachers also feel, I know I did, that we're going to be judged as a teacher by how well our students do on these tests.
Absolutely. And so that pressure is really very powerful. And I think it's harmful to the heart and soul of why young people go to school, which is to become good citizens and contributing citizens. And some of that is acting on knowledge and understanding that you've developed in terms of the academic world, but some of it is equally as important, is in terms of how we treat one another, how we act when we get upset, how we behave towards people, even if we don't really necessarily like them. But so this notion of, the moment, the compass of any moment should be not just on discrete knowledge, but it's also on the heart and soul of education. Who are we as individuals? Who do we want to be? And how are we shaping that side by side with the technical knowledge and skills that schools have been very accustomed to, and not letting time be what's driving your decisions. But again, it's about the community that we're trying to establish. So if you let time drive you, you make bad decisions.
Interesting. Okay. You've already brought tremendous passion to this discussion, so I don't think we need to talk about what you mean by passion and enthusiasm, but I like the term implicit bias, because to me it's almost like an oxymoron.
Absolutely. So when we think about what drives our actions and our behaviors, there are a set of mental models that we hold about the world at large, about education, about people. And implicit bias is really about the attitudes or stereotypes that impact our actions and how we treat one another in a way that we're not even aware of. So that's the implicit side of it. And that we have certain biases that impact our thinking. So a great notion of this is an old study. It's the Stanford prison study, where some people were randomly assigned prisoner roles. Some people randomly assigned guard roles, and they didn't train them to be guards. They didn't train them to be prisoners, but they had a mental model of what those roles meant and held. and what it meant for them. And then they started to enact those biases or those mental models towards, in this case, the guards towards the prisoners, and the prisoners towards the guards. So they had attitudes and stereotypes about these different roles that played out during this research study in such a way that they had to stop the study because the guards were starting to be very punitive and demeaning towards the prisoners, and the prisoners were starting to act out in revolt, and so you had this enactment of certain beliefs that we held about these particular groups. Now, in education in America, most of our workforce are white, and most of our student population are youth of the global majority. And so there is a reality that well-meaning white people who come from very different backgrounds than many of the young people they teach, they hold certain implicit biases about youth of the global majority, different youth of the global majority, that will find their way into the classroom and the way they treat their students. And it's not out of malintent, but it's about how we've all been acculturated. And it's really important. I think one of the greatest challenges of facing teachers today is to be able to think about those to reflect on where those biases might be playing into the decisions they make towards their students, towards the curriculum that they choose, towards the materials that they choose, and how they react to various students in their classroom. I'll give you a quick story. When I first started this work, we had very limited options for young people to pursue college classes while they were with us, even if they had earned a high school diploma. And I realized that what I would want for my son would be in high school, that he was getting the message early and often that he could do college if he wanted to, trade school if he wanted to, but he would need to pursue something after high school, and that he was valuable in that sense and able to. And I realized that we were not sending that message in our settings systemically. And through the partnership with the department and other community colleges, we now offer dual enrollment classes, college classes for our students. And this college going or post-secondary, could be technical schools. That mentality, that mindset has penetrated our culture, and the contagious effect of seeing your peer across the hallway being successful in a college class has meant that I myself want to give it a go. And these are young people who, many of whom had not had those messages in their public schools. And I was reinforcing that, not purposefully, but by omission. And it's something that, to your point earlier, I'm fallible. And we were all part of that. And our population has changed too, but I think it's been a big, it's made a very positive effect on our entire programming.
That's a wonderful story. That is a wonderful story. And I would imagine, the impact on some of these students is going to be felt down the road when they get in touch with you or when you read about some of their accomplishments. I think that's very exciting, and I hope that people who are listening can make that same offer to some of their kids, if they're parents or their teachers, to their students or administrators, to the community as a whole, because that is a very strong motivating force when you find out that opportunities that you did not think were there for you are there for you. Woody, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This was such a good conversation, and I hope that our mentors who are listening are getting some very important information about how they too can address some of the behavior issues that they're having at home or at school. If someone wants to get in touch with you, how would they be able to do that?
So I can easily be reached at I would use my email at wclift, CLI, F as in Frank, T as in Tom, at collaborative.org. And would love to hear from people. And I want to thank you for offering this podcast to the listening public, because I think you can never get enough good ideas from the wisdom out in the field. And this is hard work. It's very hard work.
As we found out all the times we tried.
That's exactly right. And it's very rewarding. And I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you, and I appreciate your giving so much of your time. Thank you, mentors, for joining us. Please go to justeducationfirst.com and learn more about what we are trying to do, the library, the free library that we're trying to create for all mentors of struggling students to go and get some direction in their quest for information. I want to thank Woody and all of our guests for giving so much of their time to help to create this library. Our podcasts are also will be on YouTube and iTunes and Spotify, as well as our website at justeducationfirst.com. Please subscribe so that you don't miss each of the podcasts that we'll be putting out, and then you can kind of investigate whether it's something that you're interested in. We have a wonderful guest lineup of people who have offered to give us their time. I will just mention to you that we have kind of been bringing people onto the podcast based on their availability. We are now going to try and create mini-series to do a little more in-depth investigation on particular subjects. Our next subject coming up middle of September into October will be on autism. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any suggestions of topics or people that you would like to hear.
Thank you, mentors, for being with us today. If you found this podcast of value, please visit justeducationfirst.com to subscribe to our blog and Mentorship and Education podcast so that you may continue the exploration with us. Our goal is to provide a free treasury of information for our listeners, so they can become acquainted with the amazing resources that we have available to us. We want to thank all of our guests for giving their time and sharing their wealth of information with us. Please also visit their websites and explore more of their resources to further your pursuit of the topic. Hope to hear from you at justeducationfirst.com. Have a good week, and thank you.